Welcome to tonight's event. I'm Deirdre O'Byrne from Five Leaves Bookshop, and we're launching Disturbing the Body, a wonderful anthology. I've some housekeeping comments to begin with. You can buy the book from Five Leaves. The buying link will be in the chat. If you've got questions for the contributors tonight, the speakers, could you please use the Q&A box? Feel free to put comments in the chat, but if you have questions specifically with the speakers, put them in the Q&A box. There's a Zoom live transcript, as you'll see at the bottom of the screen. So, Disturbing the Body. This is a collection of body-themed, speculative, autobiographical pieces. It's edited by Nikki West, and it was published by Boudicca Press. There's been a 3-part launch, each launch featuring 2 of the contributors. So tonight's focus is on health, medicine, and disability. And we have 2 contributors, Louise Kenward and Laura Elliott. And Louise will read first. Louise is a writer, an artist, and psychologist. She worked herself for the NHS and then went freelance. She has an MA in fine art and a master's in criminal psychology, and she's currently working on her first book. We'll have a discussion first with me and both of the speakers, and then Laura will read. Laura Elliott is a writer and journalist. She's had short fiction published in Strix magazine, Storge, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is it Storge? And elsewhere, and has a forthcoming essay in the So Hormonal anthology From Monstrous Regiment. So, Louise, I believe you had a part in putting this book together because you wrote part of the introduction. Could you tell us a bit about how this book came to be?
That's right. I'd been writing non-fiction, creative non-fiction for some years, in part in response to my own experience of illness, and had been finding different kind of experimental forms of doing that, and finding, I guess, coming back to Susan Sontag, who I know we'll pick up again later, I was curious as to what had been written since then, which was the 1970s. And I turned to Twitter to ask, and was told about Sinead Gleason's Constellations book, which is absolutely beautiful, and it kind of developed my writing further. And a short while after that, Verity Holloway was due to have her open heart surgery, and she asked, it was one of those things, one Sunday afternoon, she asked who was writing about illness. I think coming from an fiction background, she was looking for how to go about writing her own experience of open heart surgery and the strangeness and trauma of that. So I responded to that, and we, with Georgina Bruce as well at the time, we spent about a year, I think, having conversations and talking about different ideas and different formats and different thoughts. And Verity had a connection to Boudicca, and spoke to Nikki West, who was keen to take it forward. So it went from there, really. Yeah.
And you're going to read as part of your contribution to the book now, please?
Yep. So this is the start of Underland. One day I stopped. Everything about me stopped. As if I'd died, but had forgotten to finish the job. It lacked commitment. I spent weeks, then months, in bed, a half-hearted end, frozen, suspended in aspic, undead. I began to tell stories. We have always told stories. It may be the one thing at our core, writing stories as essential to life as eating and breathing. Stories pass on words of caution or hope, messages from the past to the future. There are times it has felt as though my story was all I had, the most important part of being human, of being sick. It was important to get my story right. But it had none of the things a story needed: no beginning or end, no message or moral, no answer or hope. Alice, I thought. She was the only person who made sense, her adventures after rabbits and through looking glasses. I must have fallen down the rabbit hole. I was squeezing through doors I didn't fit in, chasing rabbits with pocket watches and medical certificates. I was playing games with cards that got up and walked off from the table. This was not Wonderland. This was my reality, living with a mysterious illness that no one could see. If it couldn't be seen, it couldn't be measured. And if it couldn't be seen or measured, then it couldn't be treated. If it couldn't be seen, it couldn't be true. Unless you're Alice, I decided. I must be Alice. There were many Alices like me, all chasing white rabbits and drinking tea with the hatter, hearing the voice of the lobster in the distance. We were all trying to write our stories, writing and talking in the hope that our words would be heard, that we would be understood. I started reading other people's stories, tales of hysteria, of fear and anger, of illness stretching years and lifetimes, tales of no return. They gave me nightmares. Other people had stories like mine, incomplete and insubstantial. The endings were not fairy tales. I began to fear the story more than the illness itself. Other people began to make up stories about me. My GP thought I'd had a virus, one I was taking too long to recover from. He couldn't tell me why that might be. Everything was normal. Nothing was normal. He couldn't be sure it was even a virus. It was one that skips about, can't always be seen, one that everyone has. My mum thought I was burnt out. An old car on bricks, my insides hollowed, surface insubstantial, crumbly, flaky, blackened with charcoal. In time, I got better without a story, but then it came back and demanded to be told. Are there stories for the things we don't know? Perhaps there are too many, or just the wrong ones, when our lives, our bodies do not follow the rhythm of a story, when there's no elixir to be found, no charm to carry or spell to be cast. I'm still lost in the woods with a witch. Am I the witch? I'm in a tale where I'm no longer the hero of my own story. I'm playing a bit part, a side character, an incidental, without lines or character arc. There's no development, nothing moves on or gets resolved. I've walked into a book where the hero blocks my path and benign creatures turn into dragons. Those who might otherwise support me run for the hills, leaving poison apples in their wake, each with the power to send me to sleep for 100 years. There is no name for this place I have fallen into, and perhaps that would help to have a name. I could mark it on the map, plot grid references. This is an in-between space. I'm at the edge, in the middle, underneath. I'm in a place where people can see me, but they don't look, can hear me, but they don't listen. And this goes on for so long, all that's left of me is a trace of something suspended, hovering, like the grin of the Cheshire cat floating in the trees. I am Alice. It's the only thing that makes sense. I'm searching for Absalom, the caterpillar on his mushroom, smoking from a hookah pipe. Everything is front to back and downside up, and I have the validation of the white roses being painted red. Nothing to see here, as the packs of cards cover the white flowers in red paint, suffocating us and denying our reality. The green fly, the rot, the infestations and damaged stems cannot be seen covered in paint. But the more you protest that you are not a red rose, the greater your red rose status becomes. Suggested treatments are made for your denial of your redness, interventions to change your unhelpful beliefs, to help you realize you are not a white rose. You're prescribed exercise for your denial of your rootedness to the spot. You're not unable to walk because you have no legs, limbs buried in the ground, weighted under earth. You're unable to walk because you aren't walking. My story is still playing out. It's a horror story, a mystery, a fantasy, a betrayal. It's a story of pain and absence, of fearing I have entirely lost touch with reality. It's an incomplete story, but what there is entirely true. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Laura, you talk about storytelling too, and you say if you don't have an illness that fits neatly into a box, there's the perception that it must be all in your head. And it is like there are fixed stories out there. And if you don't fit into this, could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about who gets to tell the story, and I think that's part of it. If the enduring narrative of sickness is that there's either a kill or a cure, then stories where you don't get better and everything just persists become abnormal and fairly underwhelming for people to hear about. And I think the problem is we've kind of soldered this weird perversion of the hero's narrative onto sickness narratives. And I think you can see that in Louise's piece as well, when she talks about no longer being the hero of her story. When you stop being the hero, your story stops being told because it's not interesting for people to hear about. And you see it in stories more generally, but I think you see it in the doctor's offices as well, because they suddenly start telling themselves a story about your illness that often has very little bearing on your own experience of your illness. So you suddenly become this unreliable narrator of your own story. And in that instance, somebody else picks up the perceived mantle of authority and rationality, and it's often in direct contradiction to their perception of your irrationality. So in that environment, you tend not to get these kind of stories because nobody wants to hear them. And if they do, you're probably not going to be believed anyway.
Yeah. I've been thinking about recently that I found that Jacqueline Wilson rewrote What Katie Did, that story. I don't know if you know the Susan Coolidge story that I read when I was a child. And she gets hurt because she's naughty, but then she gets better because she's good. And The Secret Garden does the same thing. There's this miraculous cure. As you say, it's either kill or cure. And just because those stories are fixed out there doesn't mean they're anyway reflective of anyone's experience.
Absolutely. And there's a weird thing of that, of the morality of the character. If they're a moral character, they'll be cured. And if they're an immoral character, then they will suffer.
Yeah. Which kind of makes it, I mean, this sense comes across in lots of the pieces, that it's almost like you're being blamed for your illness. Like, you know, why are you not fitting in? Why are you not doing what we expect? And do you think sometimes women blame ourselves for our unwellness? Laura or Louise, don't mind. Are you going to say something, Laura?
I was going to say, does Louise want to take that one, or I'm happy to talk?
Jump in. Yeah, no, I think there's a great deal of blame and shame in illness as a society. We aren't really equipped to cope with it unless it is kind of filled with war metaphors of survival and battles and winners and losers, and I think that's from a not having it interesting perspective of chronic illness, an interesting part of that, because as Laura says, it is like the dullest thing in the world to just not get better. Like, that's not interesting to anybody, but actually when you do kind of have that space to dwell and to consider kind of other, I think it gives you other things. I'm not sure I can articulate it very well, I might be leaping ahead. But yes, in terms of the blaming and shaming, I think that's where the inward look comes as well. But there's a sense of, if doctors don't have an answer, so normally you want medical tests to come back negative, that you're clear of awful things, but actually when you're desperate to find an answer and some understanding for what's going on, to have a positive test for something at least makes sense, because it validates your own experience of your own body. And I think that's a huge problem that we have is of how much we are invalidated in our own expression of our own experience of our bodies, that so often we're told, no, that's fine. And even if it's said in the most benign way, when it's said often enough, it's quite a powerful message that there's nothing wrong with you. And so the obvious conclusion is, well, it must be me, it must be something I've done or something. So I think that kind of takes you through quite a particular route. Yes, when you become ill and don't get better.
I think also, going back to the blaming yourself thing, there's a particular culture surrounding health now. You've got wellness culture, which is, there are bits of wellness culture that are great. There is that kind of response to overwork and being undervalued, which is the self-care when done properly, that you can take time for yourself and you don't have to exist purely as someone that just makes money for someone else. You can take time for yourself, and that's allowed and somehow radical. And then there's the other side of wellness culture, which I think is based on an intrinsic fear of being human. This idea that we live inside a perishable body, and that's terrifying. So wellness culture kind of seeks to take control of the uncontrollable. It wants to know that if they do X, Y, and Z, then they won't get sick. They won't ever become like a sick or disabled person. They won't ever have to deal with anything that entails. And the reality is that you can't control a body, or only to the barest extent. I mean, accident, injury, genetic quirk, sudden illness, it's going to happen at some point. And it's not just a case of finding the right berries to eat and suddenly you'll be immortal for the rest of your life, But I think that's part of why people get blamed for being sick, because people are so desperate to think that if they ever got sick, then they'd find the magic pill, they'd find the cure, they'd find something. And acknowledging that that wouldn't happen is a way of just denying it.
Yeah. And I just said the language around health, this fighting it and battling it, it's a language of war. And that isn't how we live our lives. You talked in the book about the fact that the medicalisation of the narrative, I mean, for so long, that has been in the hands of men. So there is a gendered quality to this story, that you're talking back against it, that they're the ones with the authority. Could you tell us something about that? Go back to Louise again, or
no, can you say a bit more about that? I mean, in terms of the power dynamic, it's quite powerful position to be in. And I guess thinking about my experience, there's only so many times you can go back to the GP and for them to tell you there's nothing wrong, there's nothing they can do. And I think one of the real strengths of patients with chronic illness and disability is around self-advocacy, because we need to look after ourselves. We need to, as Laura's saying about the kind of wellness industry, we need to put ourselves first, which goes against an awful lot about what a good girl should be doing and what women's role is in the world. So yes, I think the medical narrative is kind of the predominant narrative of illness, and that covers patients as well as what's happening in their body. So I'm not sure how to. It becomes they're just a part of their work rather than existing as people with space and opportunity for their own voices to be heard, because they aren't seen as an authority on their bodies. It's medicine that's responsible for curing these things. And I think that's maybe part of the problem we're coming up against, is there isn't a cure. And so doctors are really kind of on the back foot of not knowing, well, how to deal with this. And there's such a precedent for illnesses before they're fully understood to be attributed to anxiety, and a long history of the hysterical woman that has such a strong trope in society, that it's a very easy narrative to adopt, and that's happened with cancer and tuberculosis and multiple sclerosis, and up until you have the cure or the tools to assess a condition that finds it's not all in your head. The kind of, yes, it's very hard to shake that sense that you're to blame.
Yeah.
Or just looking for attention. Sorry, go on, Laura.
No. I was just going to say, it's also a case of, you have to remember that with medicine, modern medicine at least, being traditionally male dominated, you've ended up in this really odd situation where the people who are writing and talking about women's illness are mostly men, and they're talking about it from an outside perspective. So women's experiences of our own bodies and of our own sickness is usually filtered through a male perspective. And then when we come in to a doctor interaction with an actual lived perspective, they don't recognize it because they've not heard it, because that's not the perspective that they're taught. And so you're undoing this really odd outside perspective of your illness as you're living it and being told that it's wrong, which is bizarre.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add in there, for time in memoriam, there's been no sorry, I'm being dazzled by chat and trying to concentrate on one thing. But in terms of research, women have always been excluded from any kind of medical research because they have hormones, which of course men have as well, but it leaves a huge gap in terms of medical knowledge. And so women are reduced to their ability or inability to give birth and produce children. And that's kind of what women's health becomes centered around. And I think there's growing recognition that actually it's much more nuanced and complex than that.
Yeah, it's interesting because before the kind of modern medicalisation, women would have been doing an awful lot of the herbal remedies and stuff themselves. It feels like we've lost a lot of those stories. And I'm interested in how you use literature. For instance, Louise, you draw on Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures, and I interviewed Joanne Lindbergh for 5 Leaves as well, and she talked about Alice as a kind of a role model, is not exactly, but a kind of a model. Laura, you're echoing Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, and Abby Hines, another contributor, mentions her. Can you tell me a bit about reading in literature and finding your stories that way?
Ironically enough, given what I just said about the hero's narrative, when I first got sick, the last thing in the world I wanted was a sickness narrative. I desperately wanted the hero's narrative, mostly because that's the story I'd always heard. And secondly, because it gave me hope that this wouldn't be forever. I wanted stories of the sudden diagnoses, the miraculous cures, so that I could kind of believe that one day sickness was going to be a footnote in my life that I told from the other side of it. It wasn't going to be enduring. But probably within a couple of years, those stories became less helpful to me. Instead of being comforting, they felt exclusionary. It felt like I was failing at being sick because I wasn't getting better and nobody was giving me a story that I could see myself in. So at that point, I think I suddenly became quite hungry for sickness narratives, for looking back through history, for other women who had lived something similar. And whether that came from today and modern writing, or whether you had to go all the way back to the Yellow Wallpaper and things like that to see that there were people that had lived through the same thing, thrived in some way through it, even if physically maybe not, and that they'd been able to make their mark and try and share their story regardless of whether or not they fitted into the dominant narrative. So I think I've become a bit of a magpie for those kind of stories now, whereas at the start they were exactly the last thing I wanted to read.
Yeah, but like your book fits into whatever you call, auto theory, auto ethnography, of telling your own story and theorizing about your own story. And I've noticed that this is really, I mean, maybe I'm missing the male narratives because they're not of interest to me, but it seems to me that it's dominated by Carmen Maria Machado, Maggie Nelson, Laura Fournier has written about it. Like, it seems to be mostly women that are doing this melding of autobiography with theorizing their story. Do you have any idea why that might be, Louise?
I mean, in terms of sickness narratives, these kinds of illnesses are predominantly experienced by women. I don't know the works you mention, and I know that Laura probably has more to say, so I shall pass her over
there are two reasons I think it's dominated by women. The first is that women have rarely been allowed to write themselves or write under their own name. So women themselves are hungry, I think, for unfiltered perspectives from other women, which we haven't always had throughout history. The second thing, and a bit controversially, is that I think it is a good thing that this area is dominated by women, but I think it's also a symptom of that previous silencing in literature. There's still a sense that while men have historically been allowed to be truth tellers of their own experience, they are automatically assumed to be speaking with a level of objectivity and competency about whatever they're talking about. Women aren't often afforded the same automatic assumption. We don't get to speak from the mountaintop. We're rarely given the moral authority to do that. So I think sometimes we're more likely to fall back on personal experience and hold up those personal experiences as proof that we know what we're talking about, because look, I lived it. So you can't deny that. So yeah, I think the first reason is that we want to see ourselves without a filter, because we've not always been allowed to see ourselves without a filter. And I think the second is that we still feel like we need to prove that we know what we're talking about. And autobiography helps us to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, this seam that you said you found, Louise, of kind of weird fiction, I mean, there's no real name for it, of the strangeness. Why do you think that is a particular way of telling your story of health, ill health?
I think for me, I found Sonia Huber's work. Do you know her? Pain Woman Takes Your Keys. She's wonderful. I got to do a workshop with her a couple of years ago. She's an American writer, and she really uses her pain. She has a kind of arthritis, so is kind of affected by quite severe pain much of the time. And she says that she wrote the book on her worst pain days because they were such a source of material. And she really pushes the metaphor and kind of follows the most surreal path, because that feels like the most honest, the most realistic version of what you're experiencing, because we don't have a language really. Well, we don't have much of a language for pain at all. There's a 10-point checklist that you're given in hospitals to rate your pain, which is a pretty meaningless thing, which also Sinead Gleason does a beautiful chapter on pain and rewriting a new pain scale, but and using language, because we have such a rich language and yet we rely on such kind of simple, blunt tools when we look at the body and these kind of themes. So yes, similarly to Laura, I've gone back in time and looked at people like Florence Nightingale, who I hadn't appreciated at all, had been so ill. She's lauded for being a nurse, and yet the sort of 30 odd years where she came home from the Crimean War and was bedbound is a much smaller story, a much trickier story to dig out. So I went kind of backwards and kind of through other women writers who were writing about their personal experience, because that felt much more useful in connecting with that. So I think fairy tales and Alice lend themselves really well, because they're so far-fetched and so far from reality. It's kind of the closest thing to reality. When when your body lets you down, then the world changes completely.
Well, it's Verity says at the start of this book as well that living inside a body is an inherently strange thing. And I don't think anything brings it home more than when that body starts to fail. I mean, how should you talk about the only home you will ever inhabit suddenly refusing to do what you want it to, especially when your mind hasn't changed? You still want to do all the things you wanted to do before you were sick, but the container of yourself isn't playing ball anymore. I think feeling yourself separate from the living box that carries you is inherently strange, and it's frightening and it's disturbing. And so finding a way to get that across and finding a way to tell that story that makes sense to you inevitably leads you into stranger and stranger areas of storytelling.
Yeah, I can see how the boundaries are breaking down, so there's a transgressive kind of a nature to it.
It kind of feels like, sorry, Deirdre, just to add to that, it kind of, I think the switch for me, like Laura was saying, it was a couple of years before she switched to what stories she looked at. I think for me too, it was the second time I got sick that I had to really relook at things again. And it felt like I had entered this kind of in-between place, and seen it as a liminal space, and having worked as an artist in kind of derelict, abandoned places and non-spaces, it made much more sense to me than anything else I think I'd had narrative for before.
And you talked about, Louise, you quoted Susan Sontag and her book Illness as Metaphor. We all hold two passports, a dual citizenship, the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. That kind of duality. Yeah, it's almost like you're traveling between lands. We're going to have to stop because I know there will be people out there asking questions. So you're going to read something for us, Laura? But
yes, I'll read you a little extract. So this is called Anne the Forever House. I'm going to start halfway through. It's, as Deirdre said, it's a continuation from the yellow wallpaper. So this is the woman in the walls of my house who has escaped from Charlotte Perkins Gilman's atrocious nursery and has come to live in my house and watch what's going on. And this begins at the point where she's starting to make her peace with me instead of being incredibly furious that I'm there, which she is at the start of the piece. For the last few weeks, I've been keeping away from the white walls when the light catches them just so. But I'm more convinced than ever that the other woman knows I'm here. When she returned from the doctor's this morning, her face was hard with anger, but she waited for the man to go upstairs before she started to speak. "This is my life," she whispered quite softly, until I had to creep closer to hear. And then, again, with dawning horror, "Doesn't anybody care?" I think I might have judged her too harshly, the other woman in her chair. As the years drag on, I'm starting to see that she's the most interesting thing in here. My daily routine is now built around hers, and it goes a little something like this. At 9:30 a.m., the man gets her up and helps her to sit up in bed. He brings her a coffee and she takes a pill, and I watch her struggle to wake. She blinks and winces in the morning sun, and all of her joints crack. Her muscles shake and her jaw draws tight, and her skin flushes red with the strain. By 11 a.m, she often makes it downstairs, and for an hour or so seems okay. But I'm no stranger to faking health, and I know her tells too well. She makes the man tea and fixes her breakfast and curls herself up in her chair. When he goes upstairs to continue his day, that's when her skin fades to grey. I'm not scared of her seeing me anymore. In fact, I hope that she does. I've started to creep through the white and shake the wall by her head. I think she's starting to notice, and more than once she's lurched up from her chair. Yesterday, she pressed her hand to the paint to help her to stand up straight. Her eyes were unfocused and they bounced up and down as though she was watching the world shudder. "I'm here," I called as she clutched at her head. "I know you can see me too." but she vomited up the breakfast she'd made, and the man came running down the stairs. I hid in the blue wall before he arrived. I wonder if he could see me. I ought to be careful, I'm starting to think, in case he catches me creeping. I can't forget, although I've tried, how John so hated to see me creep. He left today to go to work, which means I have her all to myself. There's something quite different when the man goes away and she doesn't have to pretend to be well. She talks out loud for one thing, and I imagine she's talking to me. Why won't they believe me? She asked today. Because you're a woman, I told her. And then she stood and stared at the wall, and I shook and I shook and I shook. I've been thinking about the rooms of this house, how many there are just like this. How many women in how many rooms are locked away with no one to listen? At least the other woman has me here, even though she doesn't know it. The man will come back in a couple of days, but she will have heard me by then. I've been creeping about, you see, even though I know that I shouldn't. I've found rooms upon rooms upon rooms just like this, each with their own sad prisoners. There's Bertha in the attic, and Dora in the snug, and Charlotte tucked up in bed, and so many others, nameless and forgotten, who I'm certain I can wake bit by bit. I'm not sure what kind of home we've made that can keep on growing like this. I imagine it stretches across the whole world and towers up into the sky. It burrows beneath the ragged earth and coils like a serpent through the rock. But it must be invisible, this warren of rooms, or else how could anyone bear it? Perhaps it's too silent, or perhaps we're made small, when no one bothers to hear us. There's not much time before I lose her forever. Some doors will never open again. The golden hour's here, and I know that she sees me. She clambers up from her chair. I have an army behind me, shaking the walls, and she has no choice but to listen. I wonder how long it will take her now to chip the paint from the brick, to pull off the paper and burn the house down and free us, one voice at a time.
Thank you. Well done, both of you. You're really good readers. I see the questions are piling up. Let's see. The Q&A. It is Philippa Coughlin. Philippa says, I agree about the terms of battle a cancer patient must fight or is thought less of consistently. That's a great stress in itself, which can cause health issues. I also think society here in UK and the USA continues to be unable to accept mortality and death. Unlike, she says, I will know, places like Ireland. We do talk about death more. I'm not sure we accept actual illness any better, Philippa, but I suppose I haven't spent as much time. I mean, when I've been unwell, I've been here. So, but yeah, you're right about the death bit. Right, Lisa says, I think it's interesting that the medical workforce is now more feminized. I wonder, do the panelists think we will see a gradual shift towards the trust of women's narratives? Louise or Laura? Sorry, Laura.
Oh, no, it's fine. I was going to say that having more women in the workforce definitely helps. But I think, as Louise mentioned earlier, the bias in medical care goes right back to medical research. So if women aren't being involved in medical studies, the problem you then have is that the symptoms that are listed as most common for illnesses become the symptoms that men most experience. That isn't always the same as the most common symptoms for the same illness that women experience. So if the workers, no matter whether they're male or female, are still looking at this false information, it will still mean that women are taking much longer to get referred to the right tests and to get referred to the right places. So in terms of belief, perhaps it will shift, but I think you have to go much further back through the medical system to get some kind of parity.
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, my gut reaction is to say, absolutely, it has to change. But also, it's a systemic issue, whether it's a male or a female doctor. They're still taught that, I think it's still in textbooks, that anxiety is 4 times more likely in women than men, which is not true at all, but it's written down, and so it's kind of gone. Yes, so I mean, it does have to change, but it feels like a kind of long and sticky path to get there.
Yeah. Sophie, your mention of Florence Nightingale's illness sounds fascinating. Where can we find out more about that? Where did you read about it, Louise?
Sorry?
Where did you read about Florence Nightingale?
Oh, well, I visited the museum. I'd planned to do a project with them at one point, and they had lots of fantastic plans, and then the pandemic happened, and it looks like, sadly, they're in quite a precarious position now. I think they were due to move, and I don't know for sure the last details, but it looks like they were going to have to close. So I hope that doesn't happen. There's an awful lot of Florence's archive online. I don't know what that is to hand, but if she drops her email, or I don't know, is there a way of contacting her afterwards? I can.
Actually, I was just going to say, Pippa usually puts up a book list, so we'll be contacting you both if you have recommendations, but there's no reason why you couldn't put the website in there as well. So in the comments box underneath, we can put in.
They've digitized a whole archive of Florence's letters, because a lot of the work she did was from her bed. She was a very good delegator. So there's much to learn from Florence. There's very little referencing her illness, but it is there. Yes.
It's amazing because it fits in so nicely with what both of you are saying. Like, Florence as a heroine is the story we hear. And, you know, as if it wasn't heroic that she was doing all that while she was ill.
Yeah.
You know, but then, there's the self-sacrifice as well. Someone says, here we are. I'm interested in the hero narrative concept. I wonder if the panel can reflect on how modern maternity care is about creating a hero narrative for clinicians and almost wresting the hero status from a woman. Childbirth has become increasingly medicalized, and rescuing women and their babies from their dysfunctional bodies appears to be increasingly accepted by women.
That's interesting and isn't something I've thought hugely about because I don't have children. But I do know that medical intervention or elected medical intervention for women has risen, hasn't it? People are more likely to request epidurals and things. I haven't thought of this as whether or not this is something between more medicalized version of birth, though. That's a really interesting comment.
What I've read about recently is about the pain threshold. Like, women of color are more likely to be denied drugs or given them later because they're expected to, you can bear pain. It's because of, storytelling again, twisted narrative.
Sorry, no, I know that Black women are something in the US, something ridiculous, like 8 times more likely to experience a fatality in birth because they're not listened to by medical doctors during when they express concerns during labor. So yeah, that definitely makes sense to me.
Alicia says, I'm very interested in the idea of narratives of illness as stories that help us finding back control over our bodies, illnesses, history as women, both as readers and as writers. I'm just curious about the effects that these stories have on us in the long run, and agreeing with the field of auto theory and pathography. Pathography is dominated by women's voices. Narratives of women's trauma seem to be everywhere right now, from TV series to new publications. These stories clearly have a healing potential, but is there also a risk of getting re-traumatized by reading or writing them? For instance, this questioner says, I find myself having to limit the number of narratives about trauma that I read or watch because they can trigger me. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Do you want to take the first go, Louise?
I haven't. That's an interesting really interesting comment, and something I haven't read a great deal about in terms of the impact, but I'm conscious that there's often a lot of trigger warnings and content warnings that are coming up. And yes, I think kind of reminders for any sort of traumatic events can put the reader or the audience back in that position. And I don't know what the best way is of managing that kind of on a writer's perspective. Because yes, I think there is very much, and there's a very therapeutic impact of writing your story, and that's certainly been really a real asset for me, kind of in terms of making sense of what happened to me and of kind of writing through the trauma. But yes, I'm interested, but I'm sorry, I haven't got a better answer than that.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the kind of trauma as well. I think it can sometimes be more therapeutic to revisit something after the initial trauma has passed and try to make sense of it in retrospect. Sometimes trying to write through it when you're in the middle of it can have the opposite effect, because you lack any kind of sense of objectivity. It can be really useful to write as an expressive exercise when you're in it, but also it can be a bit dangerous in terms of you're immersing yourself even further in it when you're still not out and you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Having said that, with chronic illness, I think it's easy to see that you go through peaks and troughs and levels of acceptance. Like I've basically accepted that I'm sick now, but sometimes grief will slam into you and you want to throw things at the walls again. I don't tend to write when I'm in that state. If that ever happens, that's the point where I go, I need to not think about any of this. But when I'm more settled and when I'm in a better place with it, I think it can be really helpful then to revisit experiences you've had and work through them that way.
I mean, I think just to add to that, a good point around not looking to publish your work when it's been written at that very vulnerable time, and the kind of vulnerability you are of the kind of self-exposure and feeling particularly fragile. I think is something that you kind of need to be thoughtful and mindful of, and have that space for reflection, and being careful with kind of when and where you share it with the world, for sure.
I can't get to all the questions, quite a lot, because we're going to have to finish. That was wonderful. It's a question a comment from Alison says, if we read Adam's K, this is going to hurt. We'll find out more about the training of obstetrics. But there's one interesting question. I'm going to leave you with this. What next? Will there be another collection? I know you're both writing.
Well, as I'm only a contributor, I wasn't involved in making the book. It's not really my place to say whether or not Boudicca should do another anthology on this subject. What I can say is I think there's always a lot of space for these kind of stories. And I think in the 21st century, we can see how ridiculous it is that most writing about women's health has come from men. So I'd always be excited to see more sick women writing more stories in more anthologies.
I mean, we certainly had a lot of submissions, and it was really, really tricky narrowing it down. It did become about kind of curating a object as much as the writing, and there's a lot of writing that I guess I'm doing, which I'm interested in following up. I mean, which potentially could be an anthology around how we navigate the landscape and kind of bodies in landscape, and how people with chronic illness, disability are able to navigate the natural world, because it's not necessarily particularly hospitable to us, and kind of brings more demands. I know Kate Davis, a poet, has written beautifully about her experience of that. And additionally, I wanted to mention, I guess, one of the projects I've done since Boudicca was to reconnect with my psychology background and to set up a project called Zebra Psych, which looks at it's a more of a non-fiction writing project, but looking to bridge the gap between practitioners and patients in having space to share those stories, as well as being kind of more practical resource and engaging with current conversations around health and medicine as well. So it's kind of triggered various things, but yes, hopefully more to come.
Yeah, and I think you've made a really important step in opening the door to other people's stories as well. Both of you mentioned that, but well done and thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, all your attendees, thank you as well. So goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Everyone.